Hello friends. So I don't usually weigh in on like Booktok or AuthorTube, whatever, controversies. In fact, one of my upcoming videos is actually about the very topic of avoiding drama in the writing communities and why I don't even follow it. But someone asked me what my opinion was of the Age of Scorpius situation. And when someone actually specifically asks me like that they would like to know what I think about something, my curiosity does get piqued to check out what is happening, that somebody wants to know what I think about it. So I went down that rabbit hole a little bit. And the author at the center of this controversy, Audra Winter, recently published a book that she has been working on since she was 12. Now, at the age of 22, 10 years later, she has released this book, and it has been met with a lot of criticism from the reader community. The reason that I wanted to talk about this is because I have been publishing books set in a fantasy world that I started developing when I was 11. I've talked about this quite a lot on the channel, the origins of this world, the journey to get to publication, and all that. So it does make me like cringe a little bit when I see someone who did the same thing and they're getting chewed up for it, especially because I saw a lot of comments from people like, that's a red flag when people say they've been working on something for 10 years or when they started it when they were a kid. It's both a sympathy cringe and like I hope that people don't think that my books are also going to suck because I started them when I was a kid. I think there's something really wonderful about working on a story for a really long time. But with that said, I do understand why it can be a red flag. As I looked at Audra's TikTok, I felt a lot of sympathy and understanding for just how long she had been working on this story and clearly how much it meant to her and how it had been sort of a therapy to her. I related to all of that. At the same time, I could see why a lot of people have been harsh on her. I feel like I could have made at least some of Audra's mistakes if indie publishing and social media marketing had been an option when I was 22, and frankly, I'm glad that they were not in hindsight. So I want to give a very brief recap of the Audra Winter Age of Scorpius situation, talk about my own journey to getting my books published a little bit, and then give some advice to anyone out there who might be an Audra, because I'm sure this isn't the last time we're going to see this pop up. With that said, it seems like Audra Winter has been following a lot of the talk about her on the internet, and my first piece of advice to her would be to stop. So if you're watching this video, don't. Like, you might want to come back to it when you're a little more ready, but it is very traumatizing to have the internet dump all over you, and people will say some pretty mean things. Some of them are valid, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily ready to just absorb all of that all at once. Like, the best thing you can do is step away for a while and just like let your soul recover a little bit. And then you might want to come back and think about the criticism a little more objectively, and also know that, yeah, some of it's going to be kind of mean. I'm going to try not to be mean, but I have been through a lot, so I'm going to be blunt in some instances. But I feel for her, and I have also known other authors that she reminds me of, and also I have known authors who have committed pretty much every sin that she has committed. As soon as I saw this blow up and how she was getting really bad Goodreads reviews, I thought about this one author who was kind of having a moment when I was also in the peak of my indie publishing write to market career, and she was writing to market. And I remember her books just really being rough. And she got really good star reviews, even though, like, me and my friends would look at her samples and be like, what the heck is going on? So I actually, after seeing the first few pages of Audra's book and people tearing it apart, I went back and looked at this author's first pages of her books to see if, like, well, maybe they weren't as bad as I remember. Maybe Audra's really is, like, exceptionally bad. No, they were still very bad. On one of the first pages of her book, one of her main characters thinks something like, I had almost forgotten that I lived in a world that had magic. Like, she's like info dumping the fact that she's writing fantasy by having her main character remember that she's in a fantasy world. What? And then I found another sentence quite quickly, which had like staggering grammatical errors, major info dump, and was just really corny. I feel like her writing was not any better than Audra's, and yet she's there with like really high star reviews. I think the big difference is that she probably cultivated a particular review team first of people who were willing to tolerate the bad writing, and she was only releasing like cheap ebooks, so people who didn't really like her books just kind of noped out pretty early on. The books weren't really presented like they were going to be like the next big thing. They were kind of presented more as just cheap fluff, so maybe expectations weren't as high. But, you know, I'm kind of like, okay, there's a lot of writing out there that's not really any worse, and people seem to like it. So I feel a little bad for her in that respect, but I think she had the perfect storm of the writing was not ready. She was very good at marketing and making it sound good. And she released a special edition with beautiful artwork up front, so people had a higher financial stake in the book being good. If you spent, I don't know how much she priced it at. I can't remember, $20, $30, something like that. You're going to be more annoyed if the book isn't good than if you paid like $3.99 for an ebook or something like that. So I think that we haven't seen the end of great marketing campaigns for books that really don't live up to the hype, special editions for books that don't live up to the hype, and just plain books that aren't that great. We're going to keep seeing this. So this is my advice for authors in similar situations, and in particular authors who've been working on the same book since they were a kid or for like many, many years, because that is an experience that I really relate to. So to quickly recap, if you have not been following this situation, Audra Winter started writing this story, The Age of Scorpius, when she was 12 years old. She first tried to self-publish it at the age of 14. She said that she wasn't quite happy with the reception, which isn't surprising for anybody because 14-year-olds usually aren't that great at writing books, like no matter what. So she tried to get an agent. She did get an agent. She has not, as far as I know, named this agent, so I don't know like how legit they are, because there are some very not great agents out there, but she got some kind of agent, and then she said that the agent dropped all their clients who write sci-fi fantasy. She said that she wrote multiple books during this 10-year period, but it seems like she may have just meant that she was revising the original book and writing multiple drafts rather than writing different books, which is not the same. To me, one book is one book, no matter how many times I rewrite it. I completely wrote what ended up being my debut novel 3 times, completely from scratch, but they're all the same book. She said that she had a lot of feedback over these years. She's done a lot of rewrites, and her TikToks show a lot of this rewriting. So it does seem like she did do a fair amount of editing, but I don't know like what the source was for the editorial feedback she received, or to what degree that she listened to it. Nobody knows that. But she became very effective at talking about her book on TikTok for years before she finally published the book this year, just recently. And she commissioned artists, no AI, all real artists, to do numerous pieces of art for the book that were quite beautiful, and had a special edition with all the artwork that was on pre-order. And she sold like 6,000 pre-orders, which is a lot for a debut novel, especially for a higher priced hardcover. And on her TikTok, she often describes having a team, having employees. Her bio describes herself as an entrepreneur. So she got very wrapped up in the like business and like marketing team. It's not entirely clear to me who all these employees are. Like, we know she hired artists. I have never heard an author refer to her artists as employees. They're generally people that you hire once, or I mean maybe multiple times, to do multiple pieces of art, but they're like, you know, just people you contract, not like people on your payroll. So that part's a little weird. I know some people that make quite a bit of money, and at most they might mention having an assistant or a regular editor or regular cover designer. I've never heard anyone just say they have employees, like, ever. But anyway, so the book comes out and it got very bad reviews. Last I looked, the Goodreads average was like 1.71 stars, and she pulled the book and said that she was going to revise it and also commission new art and stuff like that and re-release it in December. As of me filming this, that's the latest update that I have seen, and this all didn't sit right with a lot of people, but I really don't want to nitpick particular things she said or like be mean to her. I just, even if she made some mistakes, and I would certainly say that she did, I don't want to dwell on things that she did. 22 is still quite young. I know a lot of people have been like, she is an adult, and yeah, she is an adult, but at 22, I was still kind of a bonehead. I think most of us at 22 are not quite ready for like prime time in our careers, but we might think that we are. I could see myself doing some of this stuff. So anyway, I'm going to talk about my own background with this. So I too have a fantasy world that I've been writing about since I was 11, and I was already writing a lot even before my fantasy world became established. Like I've always written, like as soon as I could write, which was like age 5 or 6, I was writing. Early on it was, mostly like really poorly written diary entries because I was a very small child, but by the time I was like 9, I was already cranking with the stories. And then at 11, I moved pretty much exclusively into writing about this one fantasy world, although I always kind of had other projects that I would dabble in on the side, which I do think is important for reasons I will talk about in more depth shortly. It was about the time that I created this fantasy world that I discovered the ElfQuest comics, and the ElfQuest comics were also conceived by Wendy Pini, who had been developing her world since she was a child. And I had this book, which talked in a fair amount of depth about Wendy developing this world when she was like a teenager and how it became the ElfQuest comic, how it developed from her like original ideas, how it had changed. And this book became like my manual for life when I was a child. I just thought, like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a world, going to write about it my whole life, and that's going to be my career, and that's that. I'm going to be Wendy Pini, except I'm going to write novels instead of comics, although I also thought I might write comics, but yeah. I was very fixated on the idea of being Wendy Pini. And I was a very good writer for a child. I don't think that anybody would dispute that now or then, so I had a lot of praise from adults around me telling me how great my writing was, or like laughing at the jokes I wrote in my stories when I was a kid. And I I fed on that praise like children would. And by the time that I was a teen, late teen, early 20 something, I kind of had like 2 different voices in my head. One was all of the praise I had ever gotten in my life and all the work I put into it. Over 10 years of continually writing and developing this world and these characters and totally loving it. It was my therapy. It was my fixation. I could talk about it for hours. It was everything to me. My whole identity was writing, and I knew that I was good at it. So a part of me felt a little bit entitled to this career that I had envisioned so hard. Like I had been working for it my whole young life. But when you're in your early 20s, that feels like a long time. The other voice was telling me like, it's gonna, like, almost nobody gets a literary agent. It's really hard to get published. It's really hard to get noticed. You are never going to be admitted into the hallowed halls of publishing. And at this time, indie publishing was not an option. In fact, it was easier to become an indie comic creator than it was to be an indie novelist, which is one reason that I thought I might do comics. ElfQuest, in fact, had started out as an independent comic book, but in novels it was really almost completely unheard of. I was also pretty resistant to criticism because I felt like I had spent so much time on this world and that like I knew what it was supposed to be. So when people would like tell me I wasn't doing something well, I would resist that and think, no, this is how it is. And like, I've put so much work into this. I have a vision, you don't know what you're talking about. So I didn't listen to critiques like that much. So if I think about social media marketing and indie publishing being an option to me at age 22, I shudder to think of that. What would I have done? I think I could have done all sorts of stupid things fed by this sense of like entitlement because of all the time I'd put into the world, and like ego, and also like insecurity. Like they always come together, right? There's like this huge ego but also this huge insecurity at the same time, and they're just kind of waiting to like clash and ruin your life. But since it was not an option at the time, I had to go the traditional publishing route, and I procrastinated because I was afraid of rejection and criticism. It was not until I was 23 that I kind of had an epiphany and realized that if I wanted to be published, I had to drop the attitude about my work, and I had to think more about like what would sell and how can I improve my writing so that I can get the attention of a literary agent. I had a friend who was a little bit ahead of me as far as like she was pursuing publication and she got an agent before me, and kind of was, she just reached that realization sooner basically. And I also had my partner Dade, who really believed in me and like helped to steer me off the path of just kind of messing around and onto the like, if you want to be a writer, then you should write. He helped me with all of my drafts and when I got a rejection, when I was crying. And it took me 3 years of like very serious, disciplined work to get a literary agent and to sell a book. And that book was not set in my fantasy world. In fact, I had to set that fantasy world aside because I kept trying to make it work, but I could kind of tell deep down that it was not working. I didn't get back to it until I was 33 when self-publishing became an option. I published my first attempt at a book set in the world, and it also didn't really work out. So I pulled it from sale, and in 2016, I finally figured out one of the big problems I had with my world is that it had a few somewhat unusual concepts that people had trouble like understanding what the world was. The concept is that it is a like high fantasy world that once upon a time, back in ancient times, used to trade with our world through like a portal. But then they decided that our world was kind of a mess and they closed the portal and lost track of it entirely, only to reopen it in the 1880s in our world. At this point, it was just one like political faction that had figured out how to reopen the portal, and they really wanted to wage war with like another group. So when they opened the portal and saw how advanced our world had become, they started stealing our technology, and then they started stealing culture. If you've ever played Civilization where there's like you can win by a culture victory, they basically started to realize that like we can win not just with technology and war, but also with culture. So the world kind of basically becomes modernized. I still think this is a very interesting concept for a fantasy world, not entirely unique, but I haven't found anyone who's done it in quite the same way that I have. But it is also very hard to explain, especially since, like, you know, there's a lot of other stuff going on, all the little stories with the characters. It is a very well-developed fantasy world before you get to, like, the influences from our world coming in. More common to see fantasy worlds that are just kind of like, oh, it's kind of like our world in the Victorian era, but they have magic, whereas this is very much a very distinct place with very distinct cultures. This is hard. It took me a while to figure out like what the entry point should be and how to like introduce that larger thematic concept, but within the context of like smaller stories with very relatable characters. Only in the last 2 years have I really devoted myself to this fantasy world, and people seem to be generally liking it, and I'm now selling copies of those books on a daily basis, at least in a steady trickle, and getting pretty good reviews. It feels like all the work that I put into it over the years to try to figure out how to tell the story was worth it, that I figured it out. But I did not feel ready to really do this. I did not really feel confident in it until just recently, after writing so many other books, working with editors and traditional publishing, writing to market really aggressively in indie publishing for some years. Like, I went through a lot and I learned so much about how to write well and also how to communicate with an audience before I got to this point where I could figure out like how to communicate my world to an audience in a way that they would relate to it and like it and understand it. So that's where I relate to this Audra Winter story a lot, and I hope that she also finds a way to get to that point where she knows how to tell it in a way that people really love it. I wish that for her. So with all that said, here's like the advice that I would give anyone who is thinking of doing the same thing as her. Not that anybody probably is intentionally, but you know, it's gonna happen. Here would be my theoretical advice to her. First, she really should drop the corporate speak. She talks so much about the employees being an entrepreneur. Even her TikTok handle says like LLC at the end. Like, she seems very focused on like the corporate speak aspect of it, and I think that's something that is really turning people off. She clearly understands that like why AI is problematic in the arts, because she talks a lot about how she hired real artists and did not want to use any AI in her artwork, and that is great. So I would urge her to think, because the AI thing is only part of a general like corporate commercialization and like capitalism encroaching on artwork, and part of the same reason people don't like the AI thing is sort of related to why people are turned off by all the corporate speak, I think. There's a lot of resistance to the current version of capitalism we're living in now, especially the kind of people that like read a lot and are passionate about the arts. People don't want to see artists as like owning a mega corporation and like having a bunch of employees, and like, you know, you don't need to sound like a tech company. You're not going to be selling this book on Shark Tank. Also, you don't need employees. Like, it's not entirely clear to me whether any of these people are really employees. Like, is she giving them like a tax, you know, form for an employee at the end of the year? I kind of doubt it, but a debut author really only needs a good editor and a good cover designer. If you have anything more than that, it is overkill at this point. Talking about like a team of like 20 people makes you wonder what is going on there. And it gives off like tech company vibes that I don't think anybody wants to see in a book series. Somewhat related, just as you wouldn't have a team of 20 employees before you've even released one book and seen what the reception is like, I don't think a debut author should be releasing a special edition on pre-order. Now, if you have the money to hire all the artists and make a pretty book, and like you really want that, like maybe you just want it for yourself, but you know, hey, other people might want it too. I mean, it's not like there's anything really wrong with that. It's just really hyping up a beautiful hardcover definitely has a lot of perils when you're a debut author, and you also really don't need it. I think there's been so much in the way of these special editions, beautiful artwork and sprayed edges and stuff in indie publishing lately, and just book publishing in general, that people might be starting to think that they need that, and honestly, I would not. I have never released a special edition of anything, and partly that's because I just want to spend my time writing, and I don't want to take so much time to figure all that out. Who's going to be the publisher? Who will my artist be? Talking to artists takes a lot of time. Like, I feel like you wouldn't do that until you've already sold thousands of copies, unless you just want to do it for yourself. But it probably isn't what I would hype up as a debut author. Like, just see if the cheap ebook does well first before you go all in on expensive editions. And the third thing is, I think it's a very common mistake, especially with fantasy writers, to get really caught up in the world building early on. The world building part is very fun. It's very fun to talk about it, and I think that's probably the dream of many fantasy authors, to be famous enough that people really want to hear about your world building. When I was a kid, I loved those like supplementary books, whether it was this one or the one for like the Xanth series, the Pern series, you know, like any big series had like that like extra book that would talk about all the background stuff. And it was my life's goal to have one of those. But when you're new, no one really cares about your world building. The world building is only interesting once you've invested in the story and characters. Unless you're like developing a really cool like RPG or something, which if she never gets to the point where she really wants to devote her time to the story and the characters, maybe she should just develop an RPG instead. But I did think it was a little surprising to me when I looked at her TikTok that I didn't see her mention like specific characters and like things they went through, or like bits of dialogue that she loved from them, or parts of the story, moments that like really got to her as she was writing them. I didn't see a lot of talk about that sort of thing, and that is a bit of a red flag to me in a writer, that they just haven't really spent the time thinking about the most core parts of a story yet, that they're still in that like, ooh, shiny world building stage, which is common. But that part's kind of more for you, at least for a long while. Now, this might be my harshest bit of advice, but the amount of time you spend on a story and how much it means to you, it just ain't shit to anybody. People have an inherent selfishness, which makes sense because, you know, you're not going to read a book out of charity because the author loved it so much. You're not going to sit there and read a book that's not very good because it means so much to the author and they spent 10 or 20 years on it. No one has time for that. The audience needs to get something out of the book, and they don't really care how much time you spent on it and how much you love it. They're in it for their reading experience. No author is entitled to readership just because of how much they love their story. And even though writing for 10 years can feel like a long time, even so, if you've been writing since you were 10 and you're 20 now, your writing is probably still kind of bad. Especially if you've never gone through a phase of just being really aware that your writing is bad. I get the feeling that she's probably never gone through a long stretch of just throwing herself into the like, you know what, I need to put a ton of work into this. Now, I don't know, because she does talk about doing edits, and I don't know, like, she clearly did work on it. But I was writing stories, like completed stories that I worked really hard on from the time I was 9 years old, and I wrote a lot. It was not just like a once in a while thing. It was like a constantly writing from the age of 9, and I did not get published until I was 26. So that's almost 20 years of writing, but it is not like I didn't enter the industry in any real sense. Really, I feel like not until I was 26 and I sold my first book did my time in the industry actually begin. So the fact that she sometimes says that she's been in the publishing industry for 10 years, that makes me feel like she hasn't really fully accepted what being a professional writer really entails, because nothing that you do as a child, if she really did work with a good agent for a while on edits, maybe the time clock could have started there. I don't want to make a lot of assumptions about the work that she's done up until this point, because I really don't know. But she has a video where she mentions like the 10,000 hours that, you know, isn't even necessarily true, but let's say it is. Let's say after 10,000 hours, people do become a master. If that even was true, in my experience, there's two different, like, there's the 10,000 hours of just writing for yourself. Like, maybe you're dreaming about publication or even trying to get published. But if you're primarily writing for yourself, for what you get out of the writing, you haven't started the time clock of the 10,000 hours yet. From my experience, the 10,000 hours of work begins when you start thinking about, how do I connect with an audience? Once you start thinking of your work from that perspective, that takes a whole different kind of mindset for a lot of people. Some writers just have the natural ability to connect with an audience and don't need to think about it as much, but I was not one of those. A lot of people aren't. I was writing for me, and when I got feedback from people in the earlier years, I was resistant to it because it would mean taking away from some of the writing for myself. And I was not ready to do that yet. When I started to actually find success is when I started to think about, how can the audience connect to my work? How can I give people something that they want to read? They understand what's going on. They're enjoying it. They want to stay up past their bedtime reading it. How do I get to that? And that basically was like a whole new aspect of writing that I had to learn and I had to spend some years working on before I was able to get published. If you're making any kind of excuses for an audience's lack of connection, you are not ready yet. Because ultimately, you can complain until the cows come home about how people just don't get it. But the fact is that if you want them to be your readers, then it's your job to figure out how they can get it. Otherwise, you're just writing for yourself, which is fine. Or maybe you're writing for like a micro, like, your best friend or somebody who has loved your work all along. That's fine. If that's what you enjoy and you don't want to change your work so that like thousands of people will get it, I completely support that. But the fact remains that you're not going to do well in publication, whether it's indie or looking for an agent in a publication deal, unless you're willing to figure out how people can get it. And that's the journey that I had to go on with my fantasy world. I had to spend years thinking about how can I tell this story so that people will get it, so that they'll pick it up because it sounds like a gripping story, has a great synopsis. When they start it, they really want to know where it's going with the character. And now that I've gone through all that work to present my fantasy world in a way that people seem to finally be getting it, connecting with it, enjoying it, wanting to know more about the characters, I no longer feel like I'm compromising it, because once you kind of learn to let go of some of that stuff, it actually doesn't feel as bad as you think that it will. There's just this initial hold on your original ideas. But once you let them go, you often find that there is actually something better in their stead. That the things that the audience loves, you actually love too, because they're good stories. I would say they're actually better stories, both for me and the audience, than they were in the early days, because of how much I've learned and all the thought I put into like how I can make this story really hang together. But yeah, all the years that I was writing as a kid, they were good for developing certain parts of the craft. I feel like I got pretty good at writing a good character, good dialogue, things like that, things I was having fun with all along. But I still had so much to learn as far as how to connect with an audience. And that is also why I feel like if you are a writer who's been fixated on the same story for many years, I don't know quite what the cutoff is where you need to stop, but there's a point where I would really recommend that you step away from it. At one point in my mid-20s, I was in this critique group and I was working on what would become my debut novel, but I was also still trying to make the Hidden Land stories that meant so much to me. I was trying to make them work. I brought a chapter of it to the critique group, and generally, I was a pretty decent writer, so generally everyone in the critique group was this is pretty good, you might want to tweak this or that. I didn't quite understand this part. And I was like, okay, great. I felt pretty good about it. This one guy in the critique group who had heard me talk about how this is like my passion project, my big fantasy world I've been working on forever and ever, he was like, this is never going to sell. This whole idea of yours, it is never going to work. You have to just kill your darlings, put them aside, write new stuff for the rest of your life. This will never sell. This will never work. That's basically what he said to me. And I did not like hearing that at all. And he was clearly wrong, because I did get to the point where I did make it work. And I also didn't really want to hear from him, because he'd been kind of working on the same story at like every critique group. He'd bring like the same beginning that never seemed to like ever go anywhere. And he also had a lot more money than me. He was like a middle-aged dude who was like always going to conferences and getting all this professional feedback that I could not afford in any way, shape, or form. So just in general, it was a little irritating to me to see someone who had so much more financial resources to get feedback and then like still just be reworking the same tortured story all the time. And then to tell me I had to put my story aside. But nevertheless, he was a little bit right in the sense that he was the only person who was willing to be honest with me about the fact that this story was not going to go anywhere. He was completely correct about that, because I had not yet figured out a way to tell this story in a way that was ever going to sell or ever going to work. I had to step away from it. It was my childhood work, and I still had a lot of the childhood ideas hung up in it that were never going to work. The only way for me to truly see what parts of it weren't going to work was to step away from it completely and work on other stuff for over a decade and then come back to it. Now, I didn't abandon it completely. I would still write stuff about those characters. Like, I loved them so much. They were always there in the back of my mind. But for the most part, I wasn't writing about them anymore. I needed that time to learn how to communicate with my audience and then to come back to that original story with fresh eyes because I'd taken off so much time from it and go, okay, I see the parts that are not working, the parts that are not communicating when I want to communicate. And there are a lot of them. A lot of work needs to be done here. I have to rethink this whole thing. But I could also see what were the core ideas that were still good, the characters that were compelling and had like strong arcs, the characters that didn't have strong arcs, but that I could completely rework so that they did, the parts of the world I just needed to dump because they were confusing or they were stupid. And I would just advise anybody who's been hung up on one story for a long time to step away from it. Like, take several years off at least and just work on something completely different. And even if you never feel the same passion for the new work that you did for the original work, I certainly didn't. I still always wanted to get back to my original world. And I think that the world benefits from all the time and thought that I put into it, but it only benefits from it because I was able to separate the parts that were just for me, that were just like my therapy, things that I found entertaining, things that went nowhere, but that I just like liked writing. I had to learn how to separate all that stuff from the stuff that was actually going to work. And my last piece of advice is to learn to embrace the process. I would say learn to love the process, but not every writer ever really learns to love the process. I do love the process, but that is not a universal feeling. I got the feeling from watching Audra Winter's TikToks that she hadn't fully learned to embrace the writing process part of writing. That the parts that she loved best were the world building, the talking about it, the marketing it, and like the running of a company and hiring artists and all of that stuff. And you know, that is not surprising. When I started writing, I also preferred the world building part and the talking to people about my story rather than actually doing the hard work of writing it, especially getting criticism. Of course, that stuff is more fun. Everybody feels that way. Everybody would love to blabber on about their story and have people go, oh my gosh, yes, we love hearing it. I think she kind of got a taste for that when people got really hyped up because her marketing was very good. It got people very excited. And then she realized the hard truth that you have to deliver on the process part of it. And this really was something that I had to work on. I had to learn to love the process. I had to become very disciplined about sitting down every day, not just to write for myself, but also to keep studying the craft, to keep unpacking why isn't this story working? Reading a book and going, this reminds me a little of my book, but it does work. Why does this book work and mine doesn't? To spend a lot of time on line editing. You cannot skimp on line editing. Every book, especially like indie books, but even my traditionally published books that had like several editors working on them, there's always a typo left. You're always going to have a typo or two. I feel like that's a rule for all eternity. Does The Great Gatsby still have a typo? It probably doesn't, but like I wouldn't even be surprised. It's like there's always this at least one stupid typo no matter what you do. So that's okay, but you gotta put the work into like making it 99.5% there as far as not just typos and like grammar, but even just like the stylistic minutiae of your prose. Like I'm about to edit my next release. And as many times as I've gone over this book, I know that it needs one more pass. I have never really properly described the main character. I just kind of forgot. I've described the like guy a million times. I've never described her. I know there's like just some parts of the book where like the descriptions are really good and other parts where they're not good at all. I know I'm going to find more typos, more clunky lines, and you have to be like revved up to do this stuff. If something in the story just isn't working, whether you kind of sense in the back of your head that it's not working or you're getting that feedback from other people, you've got to kind of learn to take that as an exciting opportunity to improve rather than just like, no, I had an idea when I wrote it and I'm going to stick with it. That isn't to say you have to listen to all the feedback you ever get, especially the farther you get along with your career. Like if you've already had some successes, I do think there's a point where you can kind of go, well, not everyone's going to like it. But it can't be out of a sense of, I just don't want to do the work. It has to be from a sense of, well, I know this story will work for some people and I had an intention with it and I feel like it delivered on that intention for a certain audience. And then you have to accept what that audience is. If you're going to take that tack and have a smaller audience, you have to just accept that part of it too. You can't make people read your book. Whew. So those are pretty much all my thoughts. I think this got really long. We'll see how long it is in the edits. I hope some of this advice is helpful to a lot of authors in different stages of your writing process. And I just want to say, take it from me, you can get there. You were not stuck in place. I have evolved so much over the decades that when I look back at the kind of writer I was throughout my entire 20s, even after I was published and stuff, it's like, who even is that? And I hope that continues because I'm still trying to improve all the time. The more confident I feel in my writing ability, the more I realize how difficult this actually is. Like, it actually starts to seem harder the more I learn about it. I realize just how much skill it takes to really write a good novel, and it just fires me up to want to keep making my novels even better and to keep learning all the time. I think if you can hold on to that attitude of enthusiasm, you're going to be okay. You're going to get there. I believe in all of you. We are all going to keep getting better at this all the time and more able to both tell the stories we want to tell and connect with our audience. I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more from me, I have a Patreon and a Substack, as well as YouTube memberships. We get 2 bonus videos a month voted on by you guys, as well as access to my Discord, although I am having trouble getting the YouTube membership to connect to the Discord, so I really recommend the Patreon to get to the Discord, but I digress. If you want to read any of my books, my Hidden Lands books are the ones that are set in the fantasy world that I love so much, but I also have a free book of the month, which is Fae Sworn, a steamy, funny, lighthearted summer read. And if you want to stick around, my name is Lydia Foxglove. I talk about the creative life in general and the writing life in particular. So if that sounds good to you, click the subscribe and I will see you next time. Bye!